Hey everyone, I hope everyone has gotten some food and some water. My name is Laura Edelson. I am an assistant professor of computer science at Northeastern University. And a lot of my research life is entirely dictated by the availability of data. And so I'm certainly care a lot about data availability as governed by the DMA. Today, we're going to hear from two folks who also care a lot about this issue. And so let's start. Let me introduce our first speaker, Hunt Alcott. He is a professor at the Doerr School of Sustainability at Stanford University. He's also the co-director of Stanford Environmental and Energy Policy Analysis Center. He's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. There's so many of these, Hunt. I'll take up all the time. So why don't you, Hunt will be speaking first, and we have another speaker who's gonna be telling us a little bit more about research, and then we're gonna have a conversation, and I think we're gonna take a lot of questions. So, Hunt.
Great, it's great fun to be here. As Laura said, I'm Hunt Alcott. I do work in two different areas. One is environmental and energy markets, and hence my appointments and what I work on partially at Stanford, as you mentioned. And then I used to work at Microsoft Research with Leon and others, and kind of maybe inspired by that and inspired by the important issues here, I also do some work related to the issues today. So because of that, Fiona had asked me, along with Francesco, to join Laura in talking about how we can use, how data are being used for relevant work on, relevant research on digital markets, and if there are things that we can do as researchers to use data more effectively, and if there are things that regulators can do to facilitate research as well. So that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit today. And I wanted to start, given that, with a taxonomy of digital platform research. There's lots of taxonomies you could draw, but the one that's going to be relevant for what I want to talk about is this 2x2 matrix, where in the columns you have experimental research versus observational research. And in the rows, we have research with the platform versus independently. So as just brief examples, with the platform, an experiment that I'll talk about in a little bit is the Facebook and Instagram 2020 election study that Meta ran with a group of political scientists and Matthew Jensko and myself. Observational data with the platform. As a platform, you could make available your internal microdata for researchers. Leon Muzolf is going to talk about some data that we got from Microsoft to do a search-related analysis that I'm excited to see Leon present. Independently, you can run experiments, and I'll tell you about an experiment that Matt Jensko and others and I had run using basically with users, but not with the benefit of the platform's collaboration. And then, of course, there's lots of independent observational work that you can do, including, back to Leon, Leon's job market paper. So with that taxonomy, I want to use that to make 3 points. So first is that important research is possible without collaboration from platforms. So through the DMA and through other levers, it's great when we can do research with platforms, but I just want to highlight things that we can do without the platforms. And just let me give you a couple of examples. As one example, this is a paper that Matt Jensko and Luca Braghieri and Sarah Eichmeyer and I wrote a couple years ago called The Welfare Effects of Social Media. So the question there was, well, what happens if people quit Facebook? How does that affect their political polarization and news knowledge and mental health and other things? And so ideally, you would run that in partnership with Facebook. And we'll talk about how we ended up doing that later. But we also could do that independently. So what did we do? We recruited people with Facebook ads, and there are tons of papers that are recruiting subjects with Facebook ads. Then we paid people to deactivate. And so there's, of course, a place in your Facebook account that you can go and deactivate your account. And then we programmed a bot to automatically check if our participants were deactivated or not. And so there's the homepage, if active, looks like the thing in the middle. That's Mark Zuckerberg's homepage. Your homepage may look like that. if your homepage is deactivated, you see the thing further on the right, this content's not available. And so our bot could just pick that up for each of our participants. And then we can measure effects we can measure how much people are deactivated and what their downstream outcomes are, political polarization, mental health, et cetera. So that's one of many examples that you can recruit people on the platform, kind of figure out a little bit about their behavior on the platform and experiment with them with zero collaboration from the platform. As another example, Chiara Farinato is here. She, with Andre Fradkin and Chris Carr, developed an extension called WebMonk, which is an awesome extension. And I've been talking with her. I know you're really excited to publicize this in addition to the great work you have done already with it. And so that's an extension that allows various monitoring and intervention on people's web choices inside of Amazon, for example. And we took that with Chiara's blessing. We took that and turned that into something that could operate on people's search results as well, that Leon's going to tell you about later. Another example from something that I personally have worked on is something called Phone Dashboard. This is something that tracks people's app use within their phones, and then we could use it to allow people to set time limits on their app usage and basically block themselves after they'd used 30 minutes or more of Facebook. And that was a paper that's joint with Lena Song, who's also an excellent researcher. And so this is another example of things that you can do. Scrapes data, Leon's job market paper, lots of different examples of things you can scrape from the platforms, and then third-party data, companies that are actively collecting data mostly for corporate applications, but they can share it with researchers. And I think Francesco is going to talk a little bit more about that as well. Okay, with that, a second point. Now up at the top right of this matrix. So observational data with the platforms. And I think this is maybe a smaller point and more of a question, but there's a question which is, could platforms make observational data more easily available? And is there a role for regulators to encourage that to happen? And so just as a number of examples of platform data, so there's the Meta ad library, there's the Meta content library, there's Google Trends, there's the X or Twitter API, or we used to call it the Twitter fire hose. There's the Google Maps API. There's lots of stuff like this, and some of it is public and easy to use and free. Some of it used to be free and is no longer free, like in the case of the Twitter/X API. And some of it could be some data that's effectively public could be made more easily available. So think about pricing on Amazon. Useful for research, including Leon's dissertation. Could things like that be made more easily publicly available in a usable form? Is that something that regulators should think about encouraging? It would be particularly low cost for the platforms to do, low physical cost for the platforms to make available data that's already effectively public and they're already collecting. Third, there are both opportunities and challenges in running experiments with platforms. So now I'm in the top left of this matrix, experiments with platforms. And I think in the context of this, I wanted to share 2 minutes of observations that I've had as part of our work on the Facebook and Instagram election study. So first, why are these experiments valuable? So in the Facebook and Instagram 2020 election study, this is something that some people have heard about, some people may not. So just for background, we did a larger version of the experiment we had done before, paying people to quit Facebook. And then we also paid people to quit Instagram. But instead of 1,500 people in the sample, we had 45,000 people in the sample. So much bigger scale, much bigger funding through Facebook, through the partnership with Meta. The other thing that happened is, in addition to paying people to quit using their products, they also changed parts of the algorithm. And that was something that we couldn't have done independently, right? So as part of that second set of experiments, changing the algorithm, Meta did things like turn off the algorithm entirely and just give people a chronological feed of all, the most recent things among the set of things that they could have been served. There was another part of the experiment where we turned off all political ads before the election. Another part of the experiment where the news feed was changed to make it to give like more cross-cutting political content, and several other manipulations like that, where it's just like not clear how you could do that as an external researcher in terms of changing people's news feeds in those kinds of ways that people really care about knowing the answer to. And so another benefit of this. And then there was some internal data that kind of benefited the eventual analyses. So that's why experiments with platforms are valuable. What were the things that I thought were important in this collaboration? I think maybe there were three key things. The first was for all of the papers that we wrote, we had pre-analysis plans. So before running the experiment, we said, this is exactly how we're going to analyze the data. And we stuck to those pre-analysis plans. And the reason that's valuable, of course, is that it ties your hand. And when you have, lots of different researchers, including internal meta researchers who are co-authors on the paper, it's nice to have pre-agreed what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. Second, although the meta folks were co-authors on the paper and were super important contributors to all of this, the final control rights were granted to the external academic authors. So if there's any question about how the framing or interpretation would go, that was to be determined and judged by the external academics. And then the third thing was that there was clear expectations about the roles and to a certain extent about the timeline of the papers. And so I think those things were crucial to making this be perceived as an independent exercise. The challenge here is what experiments are going to get run. And I think in the case of Meta, in the case of Uber, which has run a bunch of experiments, and other cases, it's not clear how a regulator would force a platform to run a set of experiments. So I think it's going to continue to be voluntary. Then, then the question is, what experiments are going to get run? And the experiments that are going to get run are going to be the experiments that the platforms want to run, because perhaps because they have a prior about what the results are going to be. So that's valuable research, but we also need to keep in mind that there's going to be a keys under the lamppost problem with this style of research, and I don't know how to fix it. Okay, so in conclusion, the takeaways from that matrix: important research is possible without collaboration from platforms. Perhaps the platforms could make observational data more easily available. And third, there are opportunities and challenges to running experiments with platforms. Looking forward to Francesco's talk and the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Hunt. I have so many things I want to talk to you about that. But first, give me a heart attack there. No. First, let me introduce our second speaker for the lunch slot. This is Francesco Di Carolus. He is a professor at Bocconi University. He studies industrial organization and works on topics in competition economics, antitrust, market design, and the regulation of digital platforms. He is a CEPR research affiliate and an associate editor of the Review of Economic Studies. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura. If we can change the slides, please. Thanks. And in the meantime, thank you so much for organizing this great event. The morning has been amazing and the program is absolutely fantastic. So I look forward to these 2 days together. So thank you very much for having me on the program. Now, so maybe I should thank each one of you. Let's start from the first one. So anyway, Hunt and I have been asked to discuss research using data in this sector. We are mostly focusing on the different kinds of data. Hunt has done so much with experiments, with and without the platform, collaboration. So he focused mostly on that. I will focus mostly instead on what in Hunt's taxonomy was on the left-hand side, observational analysis. Observational analysis, both with and without platform data. Now, so when I think about the kind of available data, as of now, I would think that these are the 4 categories in which I would put the available data for research in digital markets. Experimental data, and we have seen a lot of that in the examples, and you've seen how precise they can be for measuring the facts that are at the heart of the research question. Then there is the most classical type of data. I'll call them publicly accessible data, and I will be precise with some examples. But think of data coming both from institutions. There are many institutions that are monitoring various aspects of the web, as they have traditionally been monitoring various aspects of the whole economy. They disclose data, and then there are data companies, which I think are possibly one of the most essential resources for doing research in this area. Then private data provided by the platform. Hunt was very clear. Inside the platforms, of course, there is every kind of data. And the last bit of data is somewhat new, is what we are here to celebrate, the DMA. The DMA partially opening this lock and giving us access to some data. And here I will have some mixed news to share with you. Now, on experiments, not spend too much time on what Hunt has said better than me, but definitely an area on which in my research I've never dwelled directly into running experiments platforms, but it's absolutely impressive what can be done. As I would say that Hunt's observation at the very end on the need to have a protocol for agreeing and ensuring that this kind of research is credible is essential. Let me remind you of what happened with Coca-Cola paying many years ago researchers to advertise some studies, arguing that it was not the sugar content of Coca-Cola, but it was the fact that we were not moving enough, not sportive enough. And of course, then Coca-Cola got trashed because when it became clear that it was financing those studies, it was a disaster, okay? So there is always this issue. So what Hunt said is definitely very important. Now, public data, so this data that are coming either from public institutions or from private sources, allows researchers to do an enormous amount of things. And I've done most of my research on digital markets through this kind of data. Basically, I've been a researcher like you at Microsoft Research. I saw a lot of phenomena that I found very interesting. And there were a lot of limitations, despite Microsoft was very gentle in many grounds, but still there were limitations, especially like when you want to disclose the name of the company, when you want to disclose prices. But there was value in those information. So the most obvious thing is if there is value, somebody will be selling this data. And indeed, almost all kinds of data are up for sale somewhere on the web if there is intrinsic value, if there is a demand for that. So they, of course, they are structured to be sold to companies, not to be sold to researchers. So you might need to agree with these companies to restructure the data, to construct an environment that is required for you, or you need to spend a lot of time to adapt the data. But still, there are enormous amount of things you can do with this data. And of course, you need money from grants to be able to bypass the platform and to use what's up for sale on the market to do your research. Joel has done an enormous amount of research, I think, also with this kind of data. So little example to make this concrete, we wanted to study what happened when Europe, Russia, and Turkey intervened against the default position of Google search on Android phones. How did we do it? We combined many data sources. Some of them were free, for instance, StatCounter, tracks the activity on websites. So it's a tracker. So every website that decides to have StatCounter tracks who visits this website and where it is coming from Google search, from Bing, from something else. Yandex is the same source, same kind of data, but from Yandex. And then some data that we purchase from Gartner, from Newzoo, from Atwick and from SEMrush. These were all data sets that are there for instance, for the app developers. Atwick allows an app developer to know what is the competitive settings in which he will try to place his app. SEMrush allows advertisers to decide what kind of campaigns to run, which keywords to focus, which markets, how much to pay for this campaign. And as a researcher, you can buy this data and use them for your research. With this kind of data, we were able to show interesting things, for instance. And this is a paper that some of you have seen, that the intervention by the European Commission to introduce a choice screen in Europe to try to break the monopoly of Google as a search engine on mobile was not effective in terms of changing the market share. It did not change much. Instead, in Russia and in Turkey, their intervention were quite effective. So we gave an interesting answer to this research question through the use of this data, for which there was absolutely no collaboration from any platform. A different study, still observational, but this was done together with the help of one of the largest existing search engines, which I'm not authorized to disclose the identity. Here, what we wanted to do was a different question. We had a model, an auction theory model of optimal bidding in a certain setting, in particular in the search ad auctions. A generalized second price auction is the mechanism that is used. And when bidders delegate their action to intermediaries, this can change the incentives. And so we wanted to test the theory, but to do that, we needed bid level data. And the bid is something that there is no commercially available data set out there that can give you. Only the platform knows all the bids. So here we had to partner with a search engine. We were able to then construct our empirical analysis and to publish it. Actually, this empirical paper was part of a larger paper, but basically it was impossible to publish the two together because when we were putting the empirical part, we were aiming for very highly ranked journal. The referees were systematically saying, oh, but we cannot put in top 5 journals that are the top journal for economists, data for which you cannot tell us the identity of the platform, the identity of the advertisers, the price. And so basically we separated them and they went to 2 journals. So this is certainly a limitation for an academic response to that. And now the new kind of data and the mixed results. So we know that DMA and DSA are creating many transparency obligations. In some respects, DSA is really creating new data sets. And Hunt had on his slides, for instance, the meta ad targeting data set. So this is something that in Europe is now compulsory. So Meta has to keep for 1 year, is a rolling window, all the advertisements, every single advertisement that is broadcasted on any one of the Meta platforms. And these intersect also with some DMA obligation, because DMA requires the ad platforms to give at the request of either the advertiser or the publisher or each one of their intermediaries full information about every single ad that they paid or broadcasted on the platform, what was the payment for that, and so on and so forth. So you would think that in advertising there is a lot of transparency, but this is the picture that you want to retain about transparency under the DMA. It's not by me, it's from a friend who is a high executive in one of the largest European intermediaries dealing with advertising online, buying media content on Google and on the other large platforms. What he says, here you see before, this is before DMA. After, you have the little x, but there is an even before. About 10 years ago, there was way more data that was available. After GDPR, after initiatives like the ATT that we saw before by Apple, platforms have started to close their data behind walled gardens, certainly motivating these choices with the need to protect privacy. Practically, because also they've started to use this data. For instance, Google has launched Google Performance Max, which is the artificial intelligence algorithm that replaces the activities that this intermediary do. And it is based on the data that are inside. And so DMA has helped, but only in part. And apparently platforms have been very good to respect the letter of the law. So for instance, they disclose certain information, but they don't allow advertiser to act on those pieces of information, because the law doesn't say that you have to allow them to target and to use, just say you have to give this piece of information. And so this is tricky. And another tricky thing, and the last that I will mention, is even the repositories that have been created seem to me, maybe I'm not good enough with data, but they seem to me unnecessarily complicated. The meta-ad library is a nightmare. So it's really tricky. It's an intersection of various periods. There are parts for Europe, parts for all the world. There is also an intersection with the ad targeting dataset, which is the same data, but open in a slightly different way. And also you have a different access procedure for this data. So it's the same data because, you know, it's advertising. It's advertising on Facebook and Instagram. But the same information is cut in 4 or 5 different ways, and you have to follow different procedures and you have to reassemble. And it's really unnecessarily complicated. With ad targeting data, you need to request access. We did it. It took us nearly 1 year to get access. We were rejected. We reapplied with the exact same proposal at a certain point, and the same proposal that was rejected in the past was approved. We did it nearly experimentally. This was maybe the only experiment. We didn't intentionally change a single word to see what was happening. Okay, and so data is evolving, data is changing, is rich of data, but the European Commission and institutions can do a little bit more to make this useful. Thank you.
So I'm going to get to ask the first few questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So first of all, thank you both. That was it's always interesting and unnerving as researchers to see the research lens like pointed back at us. But you know, Hunt, one of the things I was thinking about when I was listening to your presentation, you know, very often researchers get pushed toward platform independent work out of necessity because the platform is just not going to work with them. It's not going to handle the data. But I wonder, and full disclosure, all of my work is only ever in that independent bucket. I have not and don't collaborate with platforms, but I'm wondering, as someone who sometimes does collaborate with platforms and sometimes doesn't, do you think there is work that should only be done independent of platforms? As a, you know, as something, is there a situation, or is there a category of work that would be compromised if it was done in partnership with platforms?
Possibly. I mean, I think the biggest concern would be if a researcher is being paid to work for the platform and then is writing paper, and you have a financial conflict. I think short of that, to first order, I would be happy to write most papers. I think I'd be happy to write just about any paper in collaboration with cooperation from platform versus fully independently. As long as it was very clear what the agreements were ex ante for the collaboration. And again, key ingredients would be, a key ingredient I actually didn't mention, but is maybe the most important, is that there is an ex ante agreement that you can publish the paper no matter what the results are. And as well as, you know, things like pre-analysis plans and agreements on control rights, and things like that. There are some cases where the benefit of collaborating with the platform is de minimis. In that case, you might err on the side of not collaborating, just that there's no accidentally perceived conflict of interest. But I think that's the only case I can think of that would concern me, having worked in.
To push you just very slightly on this point, what do you think about not financial compensations, but I know something that I worry about, and it's a thing I don't do. I don't sign. I don't. Not only do I not take money from platforms, but I also don't work with data sets that aren't available to any researcher. And it's because I've always been concerned about the perception that that my work might be captured by means because of privileged access to data. And like my work is so different because I study platforms themselves, but I'm wondering, like, how do you think about that privileged access to data as something that might cause the perception of a conflict of interest, since you mentioned that as a concern for financial compensation?
It's worth even separating that into two subparts. One is the hope of access to data again for future projects. And if you write something that's unfriendly, then that could be shut down. So I think that's one class of concern, is the dynamic concern. The other is, even if you were going to retire after this paper, there's a possibility of the feeling of a quid pro quo. So I think maybe those are two classes of concerns that you might have. So, and the second one, just to say it again, even if you were going to retire after this paper, the researcher writes a friendly paper as a thank you to the platform for having shared the data already in the past. I think that a key thing that mitigates those kinds of concerns is a clear understanding with the people at the platform who are sharing the data about what you're going to use the data for. And I think once you have that kind of agreement as to like what you're going to write the paper about, and you have an agreement that says we can publish no matter what the results are, I have personally felt okay in those situations. I think a thing to add is that sometimes what the results are going to be before you write the paper, or you have a strong prior, you're trying to estimate a parameter, but actually the platform's internal researchers have already done that analysis internally, and they kind of know what the answer is. What the model is, and so how the parameter is going to feed into a policy question. I think in those cases, again, like there's less likelihood that the platform is going to be surprised by what you write. They're only approving it because they want to see that out there. And then I think that mitigates the concern about researcher bias, because like the researcher is just following the data. So let me conclude that thought. So that's the answer to the question you asked, is like, are we worried about pressure just for receiving? Are we worried about tilting the analysis just as a thank you for receiving the data? I felt less worried about that. Then the thing is, this comes back to that other point we were making, which is like the platform is only going to share data in cases where they think the results are going to be look good for them.
Yeah, I'll say like that. I didn't mean to sort of imply that researchers would intentionally skew the results, but I think I've always sort of been concerned about the selection bias. Okay, moving to Francesco. When I was listening to your talk, the thing that I kept thinking about is, when you were talking about all of those things we really can't do without running an experiment. But I've been thinking more and more about, the rise of decentralized federated social media platforms that are based on ActivityPub. And I'm wondering, do you think that there's an opportunity to the extent that there are more common standards, even if you don't think that Mastodon is our bright future, but there are some standards that are developing for social media data. If you think that there's a world in which there could be more open data could lead to situations where researchers could do experiments, or do you think we're always going to need, we would always need that like centralized home that, we're never going to have researcher sandboxes?
Is a great question. I'm certainly not the biggest expert of that. But personally, I see a very bright future for decentralized organizations. And certainly the finance sector is the one where we see this taking place so rapidly and so effectively. And we are at a conference about regulation. There is in Europe a heated debate now about to what extent it's important, and Europe should also begin to think seriously about a comprehensive regulation of DLT and blockchain technologies in such a way that there is a clear framework for this decentralized organization to emerge. And this could be a sort of an alternative market structure. So instead of trying to curb the big players, to create this alternative structure in which smaller players can work. And I never thought about the implications for data collection and analysis, but very likely in this kind of systems, you would enter into a world in which it's more feasible. Of course, also the definition of protocols from the very beginning, for instance, as this regulation gets laid down for DLT and blockchains, it would be important to think ex ante immediately about data structures, how to allow researchers, because if, for instance, the DMA was written with the knowledge that we have today also about what things have not been fixed. Many of us this morning were discussing the fact that it's really a shame that only the DSA has provisions for direct access to the platform data, but not the DMA. So you can access only for DSA related, and so essentially users risk. So that knowledge that now we have matured could go into the regulation for these distributed technologies and could help a lot.
Just to follow up on that a little bit, if there would be like one data set that you could create out of, that exists in the world of, that like exists theoretically in the world of open data, but no one has coalesced into a data set, like where do you think the most experimental potential is?
Everything, really. So I'll disclose my great love for the work that Hunt has been doing on the behavior of users on platforms. I think that really understanding to what extent the algorithms that decide on the kind of content we receive on social media platform, the information is first order. I mean, I've been studying supply side, industrial organization question, but users' behavior and to what extent information can change the behavior and the attitude of people, and to what extent this is actively manipulated and which goals by the platforms is first order. So a very extensive data set that links together various social media platforms that connects both the tech side of what the algorithm is doing and how the users respond to that. That would be my dream data set.
Oh, tall order. Okay, why don't we just open it up, see if there are any questions. Otherwise, I have a million. NIO? Oh, yes, I always happy to have an opportunity to plug. Yes, so as I mentioned, I am at Northeastern University, and one of the things that several of my colleagues at Northeastern are doing in an attempt to build maybe a data set that would help support the kind of research you're thinking of, we have a program called the National Internet Observatory, where we both pay a representative panel of Americans to install our browser extension and our various tools for monitoring their mobile phone activity. And it's effectively a place where researchers can come and they can bring their experiments and their IRB approvals. They can get access to our environment, and they can, and our data collection that is already stood up, and they can run their own experiments and collect their own data. And we, if you are interested, not only do we have that representative panel of Americans, but anyone can volunteer to donate their data. And I highly encourage you to do so.
Thanks. So two questions. One on the kind of platform collaboration. What about the replicability of those types of studies, and what does that do to kind of that part of the scientific process? And then also, what do you think the impact of increasing AI generation for personalization is going to mean for doing these types of research studies where you're looking at, and specifically the ad library? Because what we're hearing, in the advertising sector and the media sector, many others, is, this move towards highly personal, AI generation, which is just going to lead to so many more examples. How are you thinking about that?
Let me start with the first question because that feels easier.
Yes.
I have been excited as a researcher to be able to provide replication files as much as possible for everything that I've worked. So if you go to my website, like there's replication files for everything where it's legal for me to post it. So replication could mean a couple things. One is, can you redo the experiment in another setting and get similar results? And I think, running experiments is very, very costly. And so, I think you'd redo stuff only if you thought it was worth the money. The other part of replication is for an experiment that's already been done, or any research, like, can you post those data publicly in a way that's privacy protected for other researchers to validate the results and extend the results to ask new or different research questions. For the Facebook and Instagram 2020 election experiment that I was mentioning, all the replication data are available via the web archive called SOMAR, I think through the University of Michigan, and so other researchers can use it. In fact, I've applied to that. I've applied to SOMAR to write a follow-on paper that wasn't part of the initial setup.
So on the replication part, in my experience, the one study that I showed you before that we did with the platform, the data is available, it's still available at the platform. And so we provided, for instance, the editor, the contacts of the person inside this platform that should be connected. And in the appendix to the paper is described the process to contact the editor, from the editor to this person. So it's a bit convoluted because we could not even disclose the name of the platform. If you, at least, we could have disclosed the name of the platform, at least we would have skipped the step. And so it's probably very important, as it was already mentioned, but let me re-stress it, to really agree ex ante on a minimum, a decent minimum with the platform. On your question about AI and advertising, that's already happening a lot, and it's hard to say because, for instance, I mentioned before the system Google Performance Max, which is the AI tool of Google for advertising on the Google search platform, in which you give the goal. It's AI, so it optimizes on something. You give the goals, I want this to be achieved, and then in the space of, they say, maximum 2 months, it will learn how to bring you there. And is a complete black box. Is very hard to say. I think it's an important area of research because this is not happening only in Google, essentially in every hyperscaler, because now they don't want to be called anymore platform. I was told by some of them. They are hyperscaler. In every one of these hyperscalers, they are providing AI tools. We saw Amazon. Amazon now provides you a tool for optimizing on which kind of products to propose, what kind of stock to keep of each one of the products, and so on and so forth. So it is very important that researchers develop a way to get access to the data and to the algorithm, because otherwise it will become, over time, harder and harder, I think, for us externally to study what's happening in this market.
Can I just, moderator's privilege, I want to ask a little bit of a follow-up question here. Nowhere does the DMA, to my knowledge, mention AI.
Correct.
And yes, as a researcher, I also feel that pain of, we think we're making progress, that we get regulations and laws that create standards for transparency, but technology itself moves so fast that that I understand why it's difficult for regulation and transparency requirements to keep up. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about ways that regulations could be a little bit more forward-looking and a little bit less technology specific, or do you think it's too inherent in what we would want to be made transparent that it's kind of an intractable problem and it's just something we're going to have to live with, that transparency is always going to lag?
I take it. I see in the room many people that are really big experts in this, but let me try to give you my view. So DMA was drafted before ChatGPT, and apparently the world has discovered AI with ChatGPT. No? Now, and so it's this contingency simply that explains why. Then there was a discussion that regarded whether to include as a new CPS, core platform service, be regulated under the DMA, artificial intelligence as a service. And the result of that was a no. AI will enter within each one of the existing services that are regulated or other services that will add in the future, but not as a service itself, because it's just an habilitating tool. It's like electricity. It's general purpose because you can put it everywhere. And so this is why it's not there. Of course, there is the AI Act, and in these days, as we talk, in Europe, the most important piece of legislation that has started to become effective now with this provision binding companies to do certain things. It's just from last week because the AI Act, as most of this regulation is implemented gradually through time to give time to adapt. So there is a regulation for that. The last bit that I want to add is that I actually like the current structure. DMA, in my view, is there to simplify what we have learned from antitrust cases. So we have learned that there are some behaviors. Today we saw self-preferencing, for instance. Some behaviors that have been used, have been adopted, are quite general and are problematic. So we don't want now to have, again, cases lasting 7 years to re-show and reprove the same stuff. We already have understood that this is a problem. This is forbidden. But we don't want also now to use DMA to forbid every kind of new technology. So DMA is good to regulate things that we understand well enough because they are standard by now. In the world of technology of 2025, search is well defined. Marketplaces are well defined, and so on and so forth. They are evolving, but still they are well defined. AI, there I would let a little bit of freedom outside the game.
Hunt, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add to that. Okay, I will return the privilege to the room.
Hello. Okay. Just one question about the sort of collaboration with platforms on research. And I know you mentioned that there is sort of transparency around data and a sort of last say for external researchers. I was just wondering, in terms of communication of findings, etc., like, are there any potential issues around how the findings are communicated? Like, for example, like, is it the case that maybe a legal team of a platform has to vet sort of how the findings have been written, even if the data was sort of transparently shared? That's sort of one question. And the second was, like, recently with sort of CrowdTangle and CrowdTangle's demise, how would you sort of in lay people's terms explain the difference between a sort of meta content library and CrowdTangle in terms of ease of doing research, whether there was any difference, and sort of, and what the impact might be for that decision of Meta to sort of let CrowdTangle go? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I'll take the first one. So in the case of this election experiment with Meta, and in the case of everything that I've been involved in, and I think most things that researchers are involved in, there is a data use agreement ex ante or a publication agreement that specifies we're going to write a paper and you have a right to review it only for making sure that we're not going to disclose any personal microdata or personally confidential information. Everything about the text of the paper and the writing of the paper is something that we get to, the outside researcher gets to decide that, and the platform cannot block. So, and that's utterly essential.
It's an interesting and important question. So maybe a system that I've never seen but could work is to intermediate between the platform and the researchers. So the equivalent of what an editor and a journal does. And so if there were sort of like a scientific board that a user that wants to do an experiment with a platform can call to intervene, to step in. That would be, for instance, we were talking with somebody from the Ford Foundation before about initiatives that would be useful. So the creation of like boredom that could be the interface in this kind of relationship would make everything more transparent and more secure for the researcher.
Let me just, to answer your question about CrowdTangle and the Meta content API very quickly. Meta has said that this is the direct replacement for CrowdTangle, but in many ways, it simply doesn't offer the same breadth of data. That's, I think, one of my biggest concerns is that they have represented that it's the same data and it's just not. And then the other thing is that many, many fewer researchers have been able to get access. And this maybe is something that will get better over time. But honestly, there is just this persistent problem where platforms, I got banned by Facebook, but I'm not the only one. There are several researchers who, when their research was perceived to cross a platform dictated line, they get cut off from access to data. And I think that's a larger and persistent problem. I believe our time is up. But we get one more question. Okay.
I'm going to be very quick. I think the election study is an example of what collaborations should be with companies. And I really think those are important collaborations with company. My question related to that is, how can we move the needle from like one company in isolation to the market as a whole? Because a lot of the election studies say, well, it's not Facebook's fault alone. Great, I get it. But is there something broader about social media that we can get at empirically with the collaboration of multiple platforms?
I don't have a systematic answer to that other than to keep doing what I think many of us are doing, which is, lead generation. Go out to conferences and talk to people and keep proposing experiments and throw stuff at the wall. And, those things hit sometimes, and I think we can all.
This wasn't going to be very quick, so if someone else wants to. Yeah. Thank you for this great panel. Very, very important topic. So the thing is, firms are going to provide data only in the bargaining position where they want to. And so one solution, could be for somebody to threaten them, like policymakers. Like, you could be in compliance if you were to make data available in advance. So imagine the dream data set. You can imagine lots of dream data sets. And so one question to reverberate for tomorrow when people closer to policymaking are here, is that something that some policymakers might find of interest? To have ex ante data, not data bespoke post data, because that's going to be so slow. But if something were systematically always available. And then the final kind of version of the comment, which we could talk about later, is to what extent could we do it through having people install on their computers, and just monitor their behavior and sort of voluntarily get the stuff that we can't get from the compulsion from the guys who have the monopoly on the use of force. You don't have to answer this.
I would like to respond very quickly to that, because I'll say personally, I think that we will always and forever need both research that is done in collaboration with platforms and research that is done independently of platforms. And that even if we wind up in a state where regulation requires, platforms to be incredibly open with researchers, one of the problems that my work has persistently found is that platform provided data is sometimes not very good. And that, so we also need mechanisms to audit platform provided data. And the only way to do audits is independently. And so, I think like at bare minimum, we will always need a way to audit representations that platforms make. But I also think that, I do think that there's a lot of appetite if there's going to be a public square that is in an online space. I think there's just too much writing on this for all of our society. So I am optimistic. Do you want to say a little bit about that, Erie?
I'm a regulator. What's up? A number of United States federal agencies today have authority to compel data from platforms for study and publication. They can partner with researchers. It's the same authority as a subpoena. At the Federal Trade Commission, it's called the 6B authority. At the CFPB, it's called the 1022 authority. I don't remember the number for the Department of Transportation, but all the way down the line. So this, we do have subpoena power to get this information from the firms. We can get dream data from the firms. We need people who are aware of what data is at the regulators to do it, but it exists and is like in desperate need of researcher engagement to make the things we're asking for make any sense.
You know any example of a paper published?
Yes. If you want to ask Jeeves about the social media 6B study at the Federal Trade Commission that was released last month, it's like 50 pages long and has blockbuster findings. Read the opening letter from Sam Levine. But like this again is why Alyssa is a genius, is there's this gulf between researchers and the platforms and the regulators. And it's like, yeah.
Good.
Thank you very much. I am going to leave one little food for thought for tomorrow. You guys can sit down because we're going to go to a little break. But the question I didn't get to ask, which is based on the first year and a half of DMA and DSA, what would you take forward into the next effort, the next regulatory effort, wherever it might be, to impose transparency requirements? Like you mentioned one lesson around not being tied to the systemic risks, but I want everybody to think about how else can we improve upon what we have if we get another bite at the apple in whatever venue or jurisdiction that might be.